Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Skibbly Doo No Cap Knockreiner.
Why?
Maybe we'll find out during the podcast.
On today's episode, we've got...
listening to kindergarteners.
Corey just got back from family vacation, where I'm sure all he did was get to listen to TikTok videos. Anyways, on today's episode, we'll be discussing the CDK Global ransomware attack that's taken down car dealerships across the United States, an internet service provider in South Korea potentially delivering malware to all of their consumers, a hostile takeover of a very popular JavaScript library, at least the delivery vehicle for it, and then some quick breaking news on a critical vulnerability in OpenSSH. With that...
Sounds like light, relaxing news, so we should have fun.
Yeah, let's just roll on in.
Crawl on in?
Yes,
maybe I want to crawl on out.
Better. So let's start today with the first story, where if you are a citizen of North America, you've probably heard this one from either a friend or family member, or just if you don't live under a rock, you've probably heard this one, where the North American automotive sales industry has been having a pretty rough couple of weeks now. I think we're going on week 3 now, after a ransomware attack starting on June 18th impacted a company called CDK Global, which if you're like me, up until a couple of weeks ago, you'd probably never heard of CDK Global ever in your entire life. But
maybe it's the vacation, or I was living under a rock, because until today I had not heard this story, Mark. Not even from friends. Maybe no one's buying cars from my family. They're all too cheap.
That's possible. Okay, interesting. I'm surprised. Anyways, so CDK Global, it's the software provider for around 15,000 dealerships in North America. Their software runs everything from managing sales, managing finance, insurance, the repairs and service department. And so if this software or its cloud infrastructure goes down, none of those things can happen like they normally would, and all have to revert to pen and paper, which in the automotive industry, it takes a very long time to do anything.
Apparently, it's not just the healthcare industry that doesn't like paper anymore.
Honestly, what industry does like paper these days?
Yeah. Can you imagine them having to bring out the carbon copy, the credit cards with the chunk carbon copy things? Like,
would that even work on like modern credit cards these days? Because like back in the day, they had like
they've literally do them. They literally can do. I mean, they have to call it in, and it's, what do they call it when it's card not there purchases? Present. Yeah, which require a little extra validation of other things, but I think they're still allowed, believe it or not. Anyways,
well, some folks trying to buy their automobile may have been using those ka-thunk machines over the last couple of weeks, because at least at the time of this recording, CDK Global still has not fully recovered from the incident. There aren't any details on exactly how it started, but we do know that the ransomware as a service operators known as Black Suit have claimed credit for it. They initially demanded about $10 million in ransom extortions and upped that to $50 million after CDK Global missed the first deadline. And Bloomberg actually reported the company has actually paid the ransom in order to retrieve the keys, and they are in the process of decrypting all of their systems now.
It's curious, though. I wonder if that means they paid the full $50 million. Although it's actually what isn't talked about. You and I will probably get into why we don't love people paying the ransom, even though we know there are sometimes extenuating circumstances. But one of the things that insurers at least do is hire negotiators. Yep. So even when there is a ransom, they tend to, on the same underground where they advertise this, they often have a account-based chat that the affected victim can join, and people negotiate. I assume Bloomberg didn't go into this detail, but I'm curious if that means they paid the $50 million, or if they had a negotiator try to get closer to the original 10 or even below. But that would be crazy. I mean, timing wise, if they ended up having to pay 50 when it started at 10, that must just add insult to injury.
Yeah. Speaking of negotiators, like a story we weren't going to cover today, last week, or I guess the week before, No, was it last week? Whatever. Someone claimed to have stolen a bunch of data. I think it was Lockbit, a bunch of data from the was it the Federal Reserve of the United States, and they even posted online saying they need to fire their ransom negotiator because it's worth way more than $50,000. It turns out the data was not from the Federal Reserve; it was from a bank that uses the Federal Reserve, like every other bank.
Yep.
But
So
sometimes
maybe they should keep their
negotiations
negotiator. Yeah.
exactly.
But I'm with you where you might have been going. I've always been skeptical of negotiation because I'm not sure if like what is their leverage? Like it seems like the ransomware author has all the cards. So once you start negotiating, they could easily just say, "Okay, it's doubled now." So I don't know where you were going, but I always wonder whether negotiation is a good or bad strategy when you're really dealing with a criminal in the first place.
Yeah, I know. And also, I think this story specifically highlights another side of it where even if you do pay the ransom and do get your keys back, it's not like that instantaneously turns the lights back on. I got CDK Global, they actually just right now released an update saying they expect to be back online by July 4th. So 3 days from now, and probably about a week or so since they paid that ransom demand. Because
Yeah,
it takes time to decrypt every single system in your organization.
yeah. And by the way, for the folks watching the video, I don't know if we officially said the timeline, but for them, CDK learned of it, it seems like June 18th. So June 18th to July 4th. I mean, even when paying the ransomware, what is that? Close to 3 weeks, at least 2 weeks of time. So not great.
And I think this also, like we've discussed a couple episodes ago, I think, about like the Ascension ransomware attack, and then also the federal government's investment into research around resiliency for healthcare. So basically, what do they do when they suffer an incident? Like, how do they make sure they don't revert to paper? This is another example of, if your status quo is your systems are working operate like perfectly, and you've got your software running the show, it gets hit with ransomware and now you're back to the stone age. Like, we got to find some middle ground in there for companies to run maybe a little lighter.
I'm with you. I think we talked about it before. When ransomware started, we kept on pushing how backup was important. And obviously, backup's important, but people didn't have it when ransomware started. So it was good to remind people. But then we quickly, I think even 2, 3 years, I mean, way more in that mark, we moved from not just backup is important, but time to restore is important. It's how you back up. And there are backup companies that not only have fast restores, but literally back up in a virtual images. So one option is if you have like one of your three, if you understand the idea that you actually probably need multiple backups just in case attackers target backups too. One of your cloud backups could include a virtual image that literally could be back online within an hour. It's not the actual restored server, but it's a virtual image running in the cloud until you finish the restore. So while I sometimes poo poo on the cyber resiliency because I just think it's the new buzzword for having a good business continuation disaster recovery plan, cyber resiliency is nothing more than making sure you have ways to quickly restore business in the event of any sort of disaster.
Also, fewer
Business
words and fewer syllables, though. So I,
That's
for one,
true.
like that new
That,
one.
that's actually a good point. I hate talking about BCDR, which is already another acronym. So cyber resiliency makes
Like
sense.
principle of least privileged or zero trust.
Yeah, good point. So now we're fighting
Anyways,
for the
sorry.
new acronyms. Maybe Gartner are earning their
Yeah, Gartner.
salaries. Make up new, shorter words for the same things. At least it's less sizely acronyms. But either way, I think we both agree it's not just. I mean, we've gotten past the part where you need to have a backup plan. Now we're to the part where it's your backup plan needs to happen at a time period that's acceptable to your business. If you're forget even automotive or healthcare, if you're an e-commerce site where you're literally making $1 million every hour that site is down is $1 million loss. So cyber resiliency, being able to restore that site regardless of what disaster affects it within minutes instead of weeks, is critically important.
And one other point I wanted to touch on this is we've seen over the last few years like a big push towards vendor consolidation and really like software vendors across the board, across different sectors, going up a buying competition to make arguably a better joint product that they can sell to their customers then. But this comes at a risk now we're seeing where if you can hit that one vendor and take down everything, like the impact is massive. Like
I don't want to get it. Yeah, I'm with
I
you.
don't know the history of CDK Global. I have to imagine that like previously maybe they had like separate finance versus separate repair versus separate, billing, whatever services, and they brought them all together. And like that is one risk of that type of.
I agree. I'm going straight to monopolies too. It's not just separate business units. I mean, it, without getting into politics, besides monopolies removing consumer choice, like you say, they're painting one big target at one place. We can absolutely see the business draw to this idea. Like when you have a huge organization, let's say like the CDK you imagined before, that was had separate departments. I can see operations and finance people wanting to remove deduplication. Look, this one organization uses the same product as this other organization from a different vendor, and we're wasting all this money. And if we bring it all together, our business would be more efficient, blah, blah, blah. So you can see what drives it to that. But to your point, the more companies you buy up, the more streamlined that business gets, the bigger the fallout if that business is targeted in a successful attack. So I'm not sure what the fix is there. I'm someone that the bigger a company gets, I get scared from a consumer standpoint because it does remove there's other non-security aspects of that I worry about, but I think security is a big aspect. But we also, you see that with Apple's walled garden. That walled garden, if you think about it, is the most anti-consumer thing out there. But while it has if you can get into Apple's walled garden, you have billions of victims immediately. But if you have the right walls around your walled garden, maybe there is something you can, being a bigger target just means you better have some pretty big walls. And if you're a big target without those walls, well, you might learn a lesson that CDK has.
And good thing there are totally walls out there that are completely impenetrable, right?
Oh yeah. Those exist. It's very easy to have impenetrable wall, right, Mark? No sarcasm. No
Exactly.
cap.
Yeah.
No cap, as the kids say. By the way, audience, that was 100% full on cap. Lots of cap in that statement.
What the hell are you saying?
There's like a 50-year-old. No cap means it's true. Cap means it's not true.
How does that translate? Like,
ask my zillennial. I don't know. I just listen to the crap they say and have to look up somewhere to translate it.
Like, okay, time to get on my old man rocker. When I was a kid, the slang was like, "what's up," which is literally like "what's up" smashed together. You could still reverse engineer it into like what its actual meaning is. What the hell does no cap mean?
I don't know.
Kids these
Skibbly-doo.
days.
Sigma. There's all kinds of crazy words that I don't get. Skibbity toilet. Ask a kindergarten teacher. They probably know.
Our future is looking dark. Moving on to the next story. So this one's for all of our thousands of Korean listeners to this podcast. So file sharing services like BitTorrents are still extremely popular in South Korea. They even have their own like kind of flavor for this.
Because they're definitely not popular in the United States, Mark, right? I'm sure nobody here in the US uses file sharing anymore, but continue.
Proceed. But in South Korea, they've got their own like kind of like, I don't know, version of it they call WebHard, which is short for web hard drive. Where it's basically BitTorrents that have a dedicated seeding server for it to make sure that file always stays online. So the way BitTorrents work, basically, in order to download it, you have to download it from someone that has it available. And sometimes with older BitTorrent files in the US, at least, or around the world, if the last seed goes away, no one can download that file anymore. So this WebHard infrastructure makes sure it stays up. They can also be a problem for internet service providers because they use a huge amount of bandwidth, and that bandwidth typically does not use peering agreements that internet service providers maintain with other ISPs, which means it costs them even more money too. And this apparently has been ticking off one of South Korea's biggest internet service providers, known as KT, formerly Korea Telecom, to the point where last week, Torrent Freak reported that a Korean language news outlet, JBTC, found that KT, so formerly Korean Telecom, was distributing malware to 600,000 computer machines in an attempt to disrupt this BitTorrent traffic.
What?
Wow.
Like, I get not wanting, pirates or even torrenters on your ISP, but you can't. That's not an excuse to distribute malware, in my opinion.
Their local, like regional law enforcement agency, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, launched an investigation and even raided some of KT's data centers last month. They identified a dedicated team at KT with the goals of eavesdropping on customers, interfering with their file sharing by any means, including installing malware on subscriber computers. Now, they didn't give any like direct evidence of any of these malware samples, files, not even like an MD5 hash or anything. But they
How? So I'm curious. In hindsight, when she's mentioned the evidence, how would they? Like, it's not like they have control of injecting the torrent, the magnet files or the torrent files. Shut up, iPhone! I
man,
don't even know where that came from. I
Siri does
don't.
not want you downloading torrents.
Yeah, it's proof that the FBI is listening to my Apple Watch. Hey, FBI, I hope you're doing good. Thanks for helping us with Cyclops Blink. Anyways, like how would, other than maybe through HTML means, I mean, they do man in the middle all the web pages their customers go through. It's not like they could infect the torrents themselves, could they? I mean, that they need to control the actual torrents to do that. So if they're
You need to control the
distributing,
torrent because it uses cryptography and like a cryptographic hash to
yeah,
validate the integrity of the
and
torrent,
they
whether
don't
it be a file or
control
archive.
which torrent their ISP customers are downloading. So it makes more sense to me that if they did inject malware in some way, it was through just normal web traffic and man in the middling whatever pages. And but even then, they would either have to know a vulnerability to exploit the force of download, or just have some sort of pop up that enticed people through man in the middle.
I think if I were in their shoes, how I would do it is similar to what you said. So, like you said, they've got man in the middle capabilities across all their customers. And if you're specifically trying to target torrent users, you could basically rewrite the magnet URL as the user goes to download that kind of starter file, the magnet
Oh, to
file,
your own version of a
to
file.
your
Yeah.
own version of that
Of a
torrent that
magnet
includes the
torrent.
malware
Yeah.
in it. Like that's how I would do it if I
That
was
would do
them.
it directly through torrents. I guess you could also, if you're not trying to affect their specific torrent downloads, you could even, as you could tell, they're going to some torrent provider page. You could have a pop up that says something like "Qubit torrent needs an update. Click here to
Yep.
get it." And so there's all. We're, by the way, audience, we're obviously just speculating, but this has to do with no evidence, just the news that somehow they deployed malware to 600,000 computers,
So
allegedly, I guess.
like, yeah, if we take a bit of a generous assumption that this is true, this is pretty insane for an internet service provider
Yeah.
to do. Like in the US, this would be immediately be a violation of the Computer
Oh,
Fraud
for
and Abuse
sure.
Act, and a pretty dang big one.
On the flip side, I think the authorities would be more than happy to help ISPs track torrenters through normal means, which is more about throttling and then sending letters. Like if you have evidence of torrenting activity, which, without VPN, hint, hint, which is something you should be doing, I think, in general, just because your ISP is watching you and can always man in the middle you no matter what you're doing. Without VPN, if they have any evidence of you torrenting, I would just work with the authorities to gather evidence, send legal letters, and scare your subscribers into stopping or sending the authorities after them and cutting off their service. Seems a much smarter way to stop torrenters than breaking the law yourself.
And Korean internet service providers aren't exactly afraid of trying to use the law to shape bandwidth. When I was looking into this story, I stumbled across an older one where SK Broadband, another South Korean um, internet service provider, actually sued Netflix back in 2021 to try and force them into paying for the network traffic that Netflix users generated on SK Broadband's networks. They claim that basically because of like Squid Games, Netflix was generating a massive amount of traffic and they should have to pay for some of it. Netflix was pretty quick to point out at that time that SK Broadband had not requested the free Open Connect CDN system that Netflix provides ISPs, basically letting you keep a copy of all of Netflix's data locally, so you're not paying a ton of money for peering agreements. But long story short, like so my understanding, my limited and ignorant and foreign understanding of South Korean internet is it's actually like speeds are pretty dang progressive there compared to the
Oh
rest
yeah,
of the
they're
world.
super fast. New
Generally,
infrastructure.
no bandwidth caps at all. Yet they're still doing, in this case, allegedly, pretty archaic methods to try and control bandwidth
Their
usage by their
users.
users. It's pretty
By the way,
nuts.
for we already did the speculation, but I started playing a video for those that have YouTube, a news video of this from Korea, and I'm just repeating this
Ah,
part here
yes,
where they're
yes.
showing a bunch of pop-up boxes. So it does look like some sort of web-based man in the middle that's trying to get people to install ABC file. So I mean, we're just guessing based on the newscast, but those pop-up boxes seem to suggest something to the how.
I wish I read Korean so I could understand exactly what the heck they're showing on this news thing. Because right now it's just a bunch of cool looking letters.
For the people watching, I at least have auto translation on the newscaster. But anyways, we should move on. Very interesting
Yeah.
story. It's neat to see if we have any Korean listeners. If you have anything to add, anything you've learned about this story in your country, reach out to us. I guess now on Instagram because we don't love X. Because we'd love to hear more detail about it.
Yes, please. Anyways, moving on. So before we dive into this story, a little bit of JavaScript developer background. So JavaScript, the active scripting language we use for basically every single website these days, is governed by a standard called ECMA script. It's actually the same standard that's used by JScript, which runs directly on Windows, and ActionScript, used by older web browsers. Over time, new features get added to this ECMA script standard, and new web browsers will add those features in new releases. Generally, new features are not backported to maintenance releases for web browsers, and sometimes web browsers, cough Internet Explorer, will implement or not implement features differently from the ECMA script standard. So, what this leads to is if you just rely on the JavaScript functions that are available in web browsers that users around the world are using, the reality is there's hundreds or potentially thousands of different permutations of what may or may not work when a user visits your website, depending on what client they're connecting from. And it would be just about impossible for a web app developer to maintain dozens or hundreds of different unique versions of their web apps just to support all these different browsers. So instead, developers can use what's called a polyfill library to implement these new standards and features manually using options that are available in older libraries. So, for example, there's a relatively new, I think it was like around 2018 or so, maybe 2008, maybe even older, new feature in JavaScript called a promise. It's basically a way to asynchronously handle a function. So basically, instead of having to wait for a function you called to return data before you continue processing, that function will return a promise that at some point in the future, it will return that data for you. So the JavaScript application can continue chugging along, waiting for that promise to resolve ultimately. And then once it does resolve, it either accepts it with whatever the data is or rejects it and begins like error handling. So long story short, this was only available in browser releases roughly around 2014. And it was never available in Internet Explorer. Microsoft never added it to IE before killing that finally last year. So if a developer wanted to use this promise architecture in their app, which in my opinion also is way cleaner than basic JavaScript function handling, they would have to use a polyfill library, which could then implement it on Internet Explorer 11 and other older web browsers that their users might be using. So these polyfill libraries, they are critical for web development, and just about every single website out there probably has a polyfill library to help some of these newer functions work on older websites. To give an example of one polyfill library, core.js was one we've talked about a couple times on this podcast. It's one of the most popular polyfill libraries with like 32 million weekly downloads. It is owned and maintained by a single
32
person,
million
though.
a week. Oh God.
Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
God.
Owned and
Oh, these
maintained by
open
Denis
source,
Pushkarev.
ubiquitous.
And this is
Oh,
the one, the gentleman
oh,
that in 2019 was sentenced to 18 months in prison after hitting and killing two pedestrians with his
oh.
motorcycle. Yeah,
I'm not laughing at him killing
correct.
pedestrians. I'm laughing at the fact that a
The
single
ridiculousness of the
person
situation.
who maintains a library that gets 32 million downloads a week was in jail. That's it's funny, Mark. My feeling on open, like I'm raw for open source. Don't control information. Let there be an open source. But I'm less and less raw for the fact that open source means security. I'm starting to, other than the way cryptography open source is maintained, without
Back in
more auditing and kind of industry-wide auditing of open source libraries, I actually think open source by definition can be less secure when there's so many incidents like this one.
So back in 2019, it actually caused like GitHub and the Node package index and even the Python package index to start reviewing their policies for transferring ownership of popular repositories, just in case the single maintainer of one of the most popular libraries under the sun gets thrown in prison for a year and
Disappears.
a half. Yeah.
Yeah. We joke about getting hit by a bus, but that could actually happen to a lot of these open
Yep.
source repositories.
Unfortunately, other things can happen to these repositories as well too. So another
Hmm.
popular polyfill library is called polyfill.io, which is hosted on the polyfill.io domain with source code available in a public GitHub repo. This was actually originally developed by the application engineering team at the Financial Times to help deliver their news media to all sorts of different web browsers. The Financial Times it spun it out into its own standalone project several years ago, but then back in February of this year, the last maintainer of Polyfill sold the polyfill.io domain to a previously unknown Chinese company called Fun Null, which I'm going to directly translate to no fun. Um,
Sorry,
the
dad
Now the
laugh.
original author at the time, the one that originally created Polyfill while they worked at the Financial Times forever ago, like started raising alarm bells, basically saying anyone that uses this library, remove it immediately if you're pointing directly to cdn.polyfill.io to download this JavaScript package. Cloudflare and Fastly both published mirrors of the library at that time as well too to keep it online. And unfortunately, last month, all of our biggest nightmares came true with this, where researchers found the library was injecting malware onto mobile devices on sites that still used that cdn.polyfill.io domain to load the library. In one example, they used a fake Google Analytics domain called Googie Analytics, yeah, Googie-Analytics, to redirect mobile users to a sports betting website. So this article Corey's sharing on the YouTube video from Sansec, when they actually first published their research, someone launched a denial of service attack against their website, and then again against Bleeping Computer, which was the first news outlet to pick this up. But the cat's out of the bag now, and there's actually been some pretty strong responses to this event. Google started blocking Google ads from loading on any website that uses that polyfill.io domain. Cloudflare implemented real-time rewrites to change cdn.polyfill.io
Real
to
time,
their
that's
own
pretty
version.
cool. That is
Yeah,
the while I worry about organizations like Cloudflare and Google basically having a path to all our internet data like ISPs, this is the upside to that is automatic rewriting of malicious domains.
it is. But it is a, let's pause there for a second. That is a giant can of worms, though. So
It can go both
Cloudflare,
ways.
exactly. Cloudflare is a CDN, effectively, like a absolutely massive on orders of magnitude size CDN. But basically, they can man in the middle, and they do man in the middle everyone's connections to actual web applications in order to speed them up and make them load faster. But with that great power means they can do things like this and I'm not going to say it, Spider Man.
I,
And
as you were pulling yourself back from Spider-Man Uncle references, I
yes,
guess.
so with that though, they can tamper with the traffic that goes through their services. So in this case, it was for good. They're rewriting
Yeah.
objectively malicious takeover of this polyfill JavaScript library to one that's safe. But in other cases, like what happens when, if we're going to play, tinfoil hat, what happens when our friends at the FBI come knocking saying, hey, we need your help with this one thing. Can you rewrite all the traffic on the
Yeah.
internet for this?
Well, we are friends. We like
slippery slope.
authorities doing legal things. We think there should be checks and balances to being able to have evidence and reasons for subpoena. We believe in privacy of legal citizens as much as we believe in, authorities having some power. So
Only American
your
citizens,
point,
though, to be clear.
no, that's another example of no cap he's throwing there. A little bit of sarcasm. Uh, Everyone should have privacy and freedom, but I definitely hear you. It all depends on if the organization is a do no bad. Like Google famously started as this organization is we're going to do good, we're going to do no bad, but as soon as profit hits as a motive, that seems to disappear into the ether. So I just don't. It's not that I think Cloudflare or Google are bad. I don't think you think that either. But your point about great power gives great power, and it's not always at a business. Owners change all the time, leaders change all the time, boards change all the time. You saw the case with Polyfill. Polyfill got bought by a Chinese government, or Chinese owned company, thus government too, and immediately its mission changed overnight. So I think it's not us throwing shade at Cloudflare in particular. It's just the amount of power you have if you have this kind of man in the middle capability through legitimate means. Is it can go both ways. So today it seemed to save the day, but it's also something we really need to consider as a global community.
Yep. So quick, like WatchGuard aside, we use the polyfill library in WatchGuard Cloud, but we use our own self-hosted copy of it that gets downloaded as part of the WatchGuard Cloud web app bundle from our own servers, not from this taken over cdn.polyfill.io domain. That is one important distinction. The polyfill library itself is safe. It is the original distribution for it that was taken over by a foreign hostile. So either way, nuts story and another bit of evidence for
What a fun new
supply chain
thing to
scaring the
worry
crap out of me.
about. And, you let me know a few weeks ago that my favorite drone company is now banned in the US because there's this fun new thing that suddenly companies like TikTok can be bought by a foreign entity and then they turn dangerous.
Yeah,
Yay. As if
like
we
I
weren't
said,
already heading towards 1984.
our future is dark. So moving on to our bonus fourth news article that actually just popped up this morning on Monday as we're recording this right now. So researchers at Qualys published a security advisory for a critical vulnerability in OpenSSH, which is the widely, almost ubiquitously used SSH server implementation. They published that this morning. Now, the vulnerability could give a unauthenticated attacker remote code execution with system-level permissions on affected systems. When I graded this one through the CVSS scale, I gave it a 9.0 out
It's
of 10.
ouch dot ouch.
Yeah, only because the attack complexity is actually pretty difficult to pull this one off, but the impact of it is crazy across the
Yeah, it's
board.
unauthenticated and full RCE. I'm glad
Yep.
it's a more complex vulnerability. We have an easy to
So
read article too, but Qualys published a very deep and typical analysis, or not analysis, disclosure of this flaw.
the vulnerability specifically impacts glibc based Linux systems, which is basically all Linux systems. In comparison, it does not affect other OpenSSH implementations, like Unix based systems like FreeBSD are not affected by this one. The vulnerability, it's a race condition that triggers when a client does not authenticate within the configured login grace time, which by default is 120 seconds. It's 600 seconds on some older systems. And before we get into like high level details on it, real quickly, we already mentioned earlier in that JavaScript section, I mentioned the word asynchronous. So basically, program execution can either be asynchronous or synchronous. Synchronous means it has to wait for a function to complete before it can continue moving on to the program. So it'll literally sit there hanging until whatever processing was going on in that function completes, and then it moves on to the next one. Asynchronous allows a program to spit out a bunch of basically parallel processing that can happen not necessarily like literally at the same time. There's different scheduling that goes on in the CPU, but different things can happen in
It can do
parallel.
other things while it's waiting,
Exactly.
and maybe eventually it will have to stop and wait, but it can do other things while it's waiting for a return of some information or parameter.
Yep. So asynchronous programming's generally it's more efficient. It allows a program to run quicker or at least handle more things more efficiently, but it comes with risks if you don't implement it correctly. In that sometimes the memory allocations for your program can get a bit funky if you're not handling things safely. So this vulnerability stems from the handler function that executes when that authentication attempt times out being called asynchronously, despite it containing other function calls inside it that are not safe for asynchronous use because they don't properly tidy up their memory allocations when they're used asynchronously. This actually is a vulnerability from 2006 that was originally resolved, but reintroduced in 2020 when a developer accidentally removed a little bit of logic that made that timeout handler safe for asynchronous use. And it gets very technical very quickly. If you are a nerd, definitely go read Qualys's advisory. It's very thorough about basically their entire investigation flow and a few specific examples of how they could exploit this vulnerability on different systems. But like real
And if you're
quick,
not, there's very friendly news articles that will give you the gist.
yes. But at like a 10,000 foot level, a race condition works by telling an application to do something and then messing with it before it can finish doing that thing. So if you say add 1 + 1, and then while it's trying to do that math, you change that first one to a 3, well, then instead of the 2 that it expects to get, it'll spit out a 4, for example. So in this attack, they trick OpenSSH into thinking it correctly cleaned up a memory allocation, when in reality, the attacker still has control over the contents of that memory. That memory then gets reallocated later in the program while the attacker still has control over it, which basically means they can use that control to modify the program execution and gain control of that program execution later on. There are some mitigations to this, like address space layout randomization or ASLR makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to exploit this flaw. They found in general it takes about 10,000 attempts on average to win that race condition, which is actually a bit of a mitigating factor on older OpenSSH implementations where they had very long timeouts of 600 seconds and also a very small number of concurrent pending authentications that they would allow. Basically, meaning if you look at OpenSSH on Debian 3 from 2005, so 19 years ago, it would actually take about a week on average to obtain a remote shell by hitting that 1 in 10,000 chance with all the concurrent limitations it have. But on modern OpenSSH, it takes about 3 to 4 hours to win the race condition. And on systems that implement address space layout randomization, takes about 6 to 8 hours to obtain that shell. So it's not a instantaneous boom, it's exposed, I've popped it, and now I have full control. It takes 10,000 attempts to do it and getting a little bit lucky with your timing. But it is still entirely possible and proven, not just a theoretical vulnerability at this point. One part about timing attacks, though, there's another bit of a mitigating factor in that they are reliant on timing things correctly. So, like network jitter and latency, and even just being far away geographically from the target, increasing that latency and jitter can be a bit of a help for mitigating it. But either way, this is a.
To put it simply, it's timing and luck. I mean, anyone that's played with Metasploit with a race condition memory vulnerability knows that if you're trying to like they're the worst if you're trying to do a live demo with the demo gods to show something on the first exploit, because typically you have to run them maybe 1 out of 5 times successfully. So you get a perfect system where you can kind of control timing and you don't have to worry about network because it's local, and you run the exploit 5 times and it fails until that 5th attempt. So what I'm getting at is I'm with you on it. It drops to a 9 because it's unreliable, and your point about some older systems that unreliableness becomes even a bigger deal because they simply can't handle the amount of requests you might have to do. But I will say, if a perfect exploit came out for this, and by perfect I don't mean it runs every time, it's simply a matter of rerunning it over the internet 10 or 20 times, or I'm not saying this out of experience for this exact one, but with similar flaws, they still end up being easily exploitable in that you just have to repeat it over and over against the same system and eventually it hits. So I don't know that amount of detail for this one, but I have seen those. Everyone's probably seen those Metasploit exploits that, it's probably only going to have 20% or less hit time, but that doesn't prevent you from running it over and over again as long as the service stays up.
Qualys actually mentioned that in their advisory too. They said that this is probably the most inefficient way to try and exploit this vulnerability. They just know it works. They even suggested, because part of the problem is you have to gauge, you have to measure your timing window, basically your window to gain that the race condition victory, and then within that there's a number of smaller windows that you have to potentially win.
I see.
And they said that measuring that window and knowing when to send that final packet to try and trigger the exploit is actually pretty difficult for them.
Yeah.
And they were using some different algorithms they created. They proposed maybe a motivated attacker could use LLM learning or machine learning.
Oh, wow.
I hate that everything's LLM these days, but use machine learning to make it a little bit easier to find that right timing. Yeah.
How do large language models help? Anyways, I get what your point. Using some sort of machine learning to figure out the window better.
And that's one bit. Even the exploit, they suspect there could be significantly more improvements for this. But even if we that's just one small bit. It is unreliable. It takes a bunch of attempts to do it. The impact is still substantial. If you've got a exposed OpenSSH server, someone can gain
huge. It's bigly. Sorry. Mark's go back on vacation, Corey. Too soon.
Anyways, a quick WatchGuard aside on this one as well. Firebox appliances are actually affected by this one, but if you are a Firebox administrator that has been following our guidance for the last decade and a half, you hopefully don't have your management access exposed to untrusted networks, and especially not the internet. If you want to, you can explicitly block the SSH port, which is TCP 4118, to the Firebox itself if you don't use SSH management at all. But please just follow the guidance we've always given of don't expose management access to untrusted networks, period. That's it.
And I presume, by the way, even though even though we're technically vulnerable to this today, but you should have an easy way not to expose it. It will be part of our PCERT process. So we will fix this in some course of order with everything we go through our security team, product management, and engineering to figure out the impact, which we think this is probably pretty low because you shouldn't have your management exposed on the internet, to decide how quickly we fix things.
Yep. Good news is our engineering department is treating it as a critical issue and should have an update to the Firebox relatively soon.
Check out Mark's PCERT page.
We do have an advisory up. That will be it is not my PCERT page. It is WatchGuard's PCERT page. PCERT.watchguard.com.
I'm just giving credit for initial design to who it should go to.
That is the best place to keep up to date on the progress of this advisory. So, man, what an exciting week. Full of things that give me great hope for both cybersecurity and humanity.
We haven't even talked about the big healthcare ransomware I heard about a while back. And there's some Hemlock thing. Maybe we'll talk about cluster bomb malware. I wish the headlines would stop between global politics and information security and everything else. I just don't like headlines lately.
Yeah, welcome back from vacation, Corey.
Yeah, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go back to an island. Maybe you can have the CISO role.
You know what? Working at McDonald's is looking more and more appealing every day.
I bet you I'd be happy as what do they call it? The old Best Buy job? Maybe Geek Squad. Nah,
Geek
never
Squad,
mind.
trust me, you will not be happy
customers. It would be the same horrible
Geek
crap
Squad
over
is
and over.
Living hell, speaking from experience.
And with
Oh.
that lovely news, credits.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, or if you speak Korean and you want to tell us what was going on in that newscast, reach out to us on Instagram. We're at WatchGuard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.